This is Joyce Tice. It's March of 2016, and I'm talking to Dennis Miller at the History Center on Main Street. Dennis was one of the founding members of the 1890s Committee, and he's going to tell us a little bit about how it got started and what some of the early years were like.
It got started in, I think it was 1990, that Steve McCluskey, who was my sports information director, I was the PR director at Mansfield University, and Steve came up and we were talking, and he said, you know, in 1992 it'll be the 100th anniversary of the world's first night football game, and I want to do something, you know, really big to celebrate it. And the more we talked about it, we realized, you know, it was really a town gown kind of thing. The football team played a night game on Smythe Park on September 28th, 1892, to experiment, with the brand new electric lights. And the game was called at halftime, a 0-0 score, but nonetheless it was the first night football game.
Who was the normal school playing with?
That was Wyoming Seminary.
Okay.
So anyway, the more we talked, the more I thought, boy, it'd be really fun to have, you know, a town university effort. So Steve and I approached the chamber, and we talked for a few months and really got things started rolling. So we formed the 1890s committee, and we're very careful right from the beginning that everything would be 50-50. You know, it's 50% chamber and town, 50% university, and we would all work together, and it worked out really well. In the meantime, I contacted General Electric and said, we're going to have this big celebration, and you guys were the ones who lit the first night football game.
Can I stop you a minute?
Yeah.
How did General Electric get involved in the first place?
In the first night
game? At the initial game.
They had brought in electric dynamos as an exhibit to show people the new electric light.
At the fair.
At the fair, at the great Mansfield Fair.
Right.
So anyway, when I contacted them and told them that they had lit the first night football game, they didn't believe me. And they put me on to the head of the lighting division, I think it was, in Ohio. He called and said, well, you know, we'll look into it. Well, he called me back a week later and he said, you're right. We did light the first night football game. And so that began a series of conversations with General Electric. And there was a lot of excitement. We had proposed that a commercial be done. And
a commercial for?
A commercial for our centennial and the reenactment.
Okay.
Because by now things had gotten really built up to where we were going to do lots and lots of stuff. I think beyond even what I had expected. So anyway, there was a lot of anticipation, and all of this, the whole commercial thing went clear up to Jack Welch, who was the CEO of General Electric. And he made the final decision, so it came down to like 3 commercials they were going to do that year. And we lobbied pretty hard to the point where they told me to just mind my own business.
Go away, leave me alone.
Yeah. But they did finally decide that it was big enough to warrant a commercial, and the commercial itself turned out to be the most expensive and lavish commercial that GE ever produced up to that time. Wow. And it debuted on Monday Night Football. All of this was coordinated. And so the first 1890s night, we actually had General Electric vice presidents flying in from around the country. And
that's amazing for Mansfield.
It was, and this commercial that debuted ran nationally for 10 years. And then it ran internationally for another 5 years, I think. So,
wow, that's a lot of publicity.
It was,
Mansfield.
Yeah, it was millions and millions and millions of dollars worth of publicity. And I don't think most people really realize that, but and maybe I didn't appreciate it until somebody, maybe it was Larry Mansfield, I don't remember, came back from overseas and said, I was in Germany, and somebody asked where I was from, and I said Mansfield, and they said, oh, that's the home of the first night football game.
It's amazing.
Yeah, yeah. So it got out a lot. Anyway, the first year was probably the absolutely most memorable because we were working probably 60, 70 hours a week to all of us to put this together. And it certainly wasn't just me. It was many, many, many people from town, volunteers, and folks up at the university. It was a huge coordinated effort. Mm-hmm. But I remember a week before the whole event, looking at the Weather Channel and seeing that the entire country was without clouds. It was just beautiful.
Every year it's all about weather.
It is, and that was my biggest lesson right there, because the next day there was some turbulence down in off Florida, and the next day it built up, and the next day, and it became Hurricane Andrew heading toward us. And so the first day of it was a 4-day celebration. The first day, it just rained and rained. I mean, it was a hurricane. And, everybody was walking around drenched. But Monday night of the exact 100th anniversary is when we held the reenactment. And the weather cleared off, and it was beautiful. It was just absolutely gorgeous. But yeah, that was my lesson, that you cannot do anything about the weather except watch it.
Every year we hold our breath for a month ahead of time.
Every year. But anyway, the big event there was, one of the big events was the Flying Wallendas.
Okay.
2 years before that, we had held an event for the Wallendas, their last public walk together.
Famous circus family.
Angel Wallenda, Steve Wallenda, and young Steve, who was, I think, 4 years old at the time. But Angel had cancer, and she lost part of her leg. So she was actually the only person in the world to walk a higher wire with a prosthetic leg.
Oh, my.
And so we held this a fundraising event for them, which they performed. So anyway, Steve Wallenda came back and said, we'd love to perform at the 1890s. And a lot of other folks thought that was a great idea. So we set up 2 events. One, he and little Steve would walk the wire. And they always walked without a net, never used a net. And then he had planned to walk blindfolded up a wire through flames.
Without a net.
Without a net. And so Steve was a very, very careful person. I mean, he came from a long line of Wallendas, and that's all they knew were this sort of thing. So he was very careful about setting up the wire for both he and little Steve and the wall of flames. What we didn't take into consideration was all of the rain had softened the ground.
Okay.
So when he walked out on the first wire with little Steve on his shoulders, they got to the middle, and the one pole shifted just enough to throw him off.
I should not be laughing, but...
You shouldn't be laughing. I wasn't laughing.
No,
I was
it must have
dying.
been a horror.
Well, we
How high was it?
We had national coverage, so we had Associated Press and ABC, NBC. I mean, everybody was covering this thing. And so they rushed Big Steve, off in an ambulance.
Oh, no, he really was hurt. How high was the wire?
I don't remember, was it 20 feet?
High enough to be hurt.
Yeah. So anyway, Steve came back about 3 hours later, because I had written off the second event. I thought it's not going to happen. Steve came back and he said, I chipped a bone in my spine. And I said, okay, so you're not going to be able to walk. He said, no, I'm going to walk. They gave me painkillers.
Oh, no.
And so the time came for the event, and this was I think it was a 60-foot long wire that went from the ground up probably, I don't know, 30 or 40 feet. So they blindfolded Steve and set the wire.
Blindfolded and drugged.
Yeah. And we had volunteers as guide wire holders. They were the football team who had just played the night before. And I'm watching Steve walk up the wire blindfolded through flames with the wire being held by a bunch of football players that I'm sure were hung over. And all I could see was the New York Times headline, last remaining Wallenda dies at 1890's weekend.
Why were the Wallendas in Mansfield in the first place?
I don't know.
Did they live around here?
Yeah, they did. They lived just outside of Mansfield.
Okay.
Yeah.
That was while I was gone. I didn't know that.
Oh, okay.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, how they happened to land here, I
Okay,
don't know.
but they were living here.
Mhm.
Okay.
And they're both gone now.
Uh-huh. What about young Steve?
Young Steve, I totally lost track of him, and then I did a series of blogs a few years ago about my years with the Wallendas, and Steve wrote to me
Oh, good.
and thanked me for writing them. He was always looking for information on his parents and stuff. But he's in Florida, I think.
Is he still a performer?
No.
No. Okay. So that was quite a memorable first year.
Yeah, it took about 10 years off my life, I think. No, it was great.
Did you at that time envision it as an annual thing, or were you doing it just as a one-time event?
I can't remember. I think in the back of my mind I foresaw it as an annual event, but we were trying to get through this first one first. And after it, there was a lot of conversation. Steve and I, and some other chamber members pushed to do it annually. A few other chamber members said, no, this was very successful, let's stop at that. But we continued. And a couple of those chamber members came back years later and said, we were wrong. Mm-hmm. Glad we kept it up.
Well, this year will be the 25th anniversary of the event, mm-hmm. which comes as a surprise to so many that time has gone so fast.
Yeah.
You've retired from the university, and this is the first year that the committee is operating entirely without your aid. But there are other people who've come along. And
that's always been the magic thing about the 1890s weekend. People did come and go, and were very dedicated and worked very hard. But sooner or later they would drop off for other things or whatever, and other people would just almost magically appear. Yourself being one of them, but so it always kept going. I think probably. I think I'm the only one who was there from the beginning.
What about Howie Carlson?
Howie, yes, absolutely, okay. Howie.
Okay, we'll talk to him too. Mm-hmm. Well, we're running out of time for our short video, mm-hmm. but you've given us a really good idea of the start, and we'll talk a little more about some of the other details. Thanks for coming down from Big Flats to talk to us.
Good, thank you.